Hi, I'm Ursula Wake.
And I'm John Atack, and this is Lyrical Wax.
It is. You had to look down at the paper to find out who you were, didn't you? I saw.
Well, it's like in Alice, you have to write your name on the slate at the beginning of the trial because we've forgotten it by the end. And actually, let's interject at this point. We would very much like you to subscribe, to like,
Yes.
to share, and to press the little notifications bell. And that would be great. Thank you.
Today we're going to read and recommend some poems by the French poet Charles Baudelaire. So he was born 200 years ago this month when we're putting this out, on 9th of April 1821, and then died 46 years later. So he reinvigorated the romantic tradition of poetry, but he also liked to shock people. So his work was slightly different from what we think of, certainly in the English language and in terms of English, UK romantic poets. So his work was very different from the likes of Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley and Blake. Because there are strong elements of nihilism, decadence, ennui, etc. But also the context in which he was writing was a bit different. So by the time he was writing most of his work, there was increasing industrialisation, urbanisation across Europe, and he sort of spent quite a lot of time walking around large cities, and as we'll see a bit later, that kind of influenced some of his writing. There had also been uprisings. 1848, there had been uprisings across Europe, and he took part in the French one. So there was a different social context to earlier romantic writers. He deliberately cultivated this eccentric image, quite hedonistic, and that had two effects. It both drew attention to him and his work, but also alienated quite a lot of people. And some reviewers who were alienated by this image and the aura he created around him sort of exaggerated some of the more hedonistic stories and legends around him, which led to further alienation. But then after his death, the image and the approach to his work changed gradually. So Charles Baudelaire contracted syphilis, as a lot of people of his time did.
Particularly in France. It was a very high death rate among Maupassant, Gauguin both had syphilis. And the extent to which this was to do with the attitude in France towards prostitution, because you had the maisons closées, which were first legitimised in the 1840s. So prostitution was legal, and you'd have thought, therefore, there'd have been better checks, as there are in, say, Nevada and Germany and what have you. But it became part of the culture that you went to prostitutes. Delius, the composer, also had syphilis.
Yeah. And he thought he was rid of it at one point, but then it resurfaced. So in the last few years of his life, he deteriorated hugely. And for the last 18 months or so, for somebody who was so articulate and whose work and life was about words, he was only able to speak in just monosyllables, very often incoherent. He was basically unable to communicate verbally. But it seemed as though he was able to understand. So that must have been just an enormous frustration. But this seems to have been, as well as him having a stroke, towards the end of his life, the last few months of his life, it seems to have been part of a deterioration of the brain that happened as a result of syphilis. So he started writing in verse, but then decided he wanted to move away from that, from sort of traditional verse structures, and wanted to create. He had this vision of creating a whole new language for poetry and move towards prose poetry. And so he changed the order of things, and he said something interesting about this. So as somebody who spent a lot of time walking around large cities, being a flâneur, as it's known in French, and sort of just taking in and observing life in cities, he describes the interconnection of their innumerable points of relationship. So that phrase takes a bit of digesting, I guess. But he found that this was really important to him. And in his prose poems, there isn't the structure. This comes first, then that, then that, then that. So there's kind of, things can come in any order. So he said everything is at once head and tail, alternately and reciprocally. So that was a deliberate thing, without having the order of the content of his earlier verse poetry. So what we're going to do today is read 6 and recommend 4. That's what we're going to do, isn't it, John?
Yes, so we'll have
and you're going to start.
10 top ones. And I was going to add it's interesting because Paris is such a constructed city. And so, it has, to be finding difference there. It's a very organised city, much of it built in the late 18th and early 19th century. So the what was the phrase again about the connectedness? The
interconnection of innumerable points of relationship in a city. But he didn't. So he did live in Paris, but he also spent a lot of time in Belgium. And he went round different cities. Yeah.
And the other thing is that part of his fame relied upon his membership of the Club Hachichin, and which may not be known to all of our viewers, that Alexandre Dumas, father, who wrote The Three Musketeers, The Count of Monte Cristo, The Man in the Iron Mask, and was therefore, I think, the biggest selling novelist of his generation, founded the Club Hachichin, where people would eat hashish in the form of majun. And Baudelaire left an astonishing description of his first experience, and anybody who's taken hashish will recognise that he's not describing a hashish experience. There's something else in that majun. It's more like ayahuasca, or may well have had a little bit of datura in it, which is not to be recommended at all. But at the end of his life, as he's dying he's in the tertiary, the last stage of syphilis, when the syphilis gets into the brain, which is why his Broca's area would be gone and he couldn't speak properly. He blamed this on his use of cannabis, he believed.
Right. Interesting.
But at this time, almost the whole of the intelligentsia of France were using cannabis. And I think it did influence the work, as opium had influenced the Romantics in England, Coleridge and Wordsworth. And De Quincey. So, long preamble, but say no to drugs and alcohol. That's what Nancy Reagan said. Just put that in.
Okay. Are we saying that?
No, she said it. And she at the time was on 6 addictive prescription medicines. And if you look at the film of her saying it, you realise that the expression "and alcohol" was cut off the end. She says, say no to drugs and alcohol, but we get to say no to drugs. And drugs are bad, and that sort of thing. That's just for any South Park fans, though. Just throw that in.
Okay.
What are you saying about him not putting things in a particular order?
Is it?
I can do that too.
It wasn't the order, it was, Nancy Reagan, when are we?
Well, we were talking about the use of drugs and Baudelaire blaming his condition on it. And it's just to say that the particular drug will have a tremendous effect on the culture. Baudelaire's poetry was certainly affected by these experiences. But as you say, he was trying to present an image of himself in very much the way that, say, Muhammad Ali or Salvador Dali adopted a public persona to be seen in a certain way.
Yeah.
Anyway, you can cut all of that out later. This is La Musique, music. Music will often take me like the sea, when clouds are low, or in clear ether, I, towards my pale star, set sail and go. With chest thrust forward and with lungs puffed out, my sails are tight. I climb the backs of all the heaped up waves as day turns night. Throbbing within me are the passions of a suffering ship, the mild breeze, or the tempest and its throes. On the abyss, rock me. At other times, dead calm, the glass of hopelessness. Bit down in the doldrums when you wrote that, eh?
Yeah, it starts off very differently. It sort of starts off as though there's something, the lungs puffed out and the sort of the tight sails and everything, and then it suddenly changes. Bit of a switcheroo. So this next one that I'm going to read is again some verse poetry. So his first,
a little bit of Delacroix on the cover there.
Yeah, which
Rape of the Sabine women,
who he very much revered. The Flowers of Evil, Les Fleurs du Mal, is his book of verse poetry, and very well known. So yes, this one is called Spleen II. More memories than if I'd lived 1,000 years. A giant chest of drawers stuffed to the full, with balance sheets, love letters, lawsuits, verse. Romances, locks of hair rolled in receipts, hides fewer secrets than my sullen skull. It is a pyramid, a giant vault, holding more corpses than a common grave. I am a graveyard hated by the moon, where like remorse the long worms crawl and turn attention to the dearest of my dead. I am a dusty boudoir, where are heaped yesterday's fashions, and where withered roses, pale pastels, and faded old bouquets, alone breathe perfume from an opened flask. Nothing is longer than the limping days, when under heavy snowflakes of the years, ennui, the fruit of dulling lassitude, takes on the size of immortality. Henceforth, O living flesh, you are no more. You are of granite, wrapped in a vague dread, slumbering in some Sahara's hazy sands, an ancient sphinx lost to a careless world, forgotten on the map, whose haughty mood sings only in the glow of setting sun.
Boucher was a painter. It's mentioned the pale pastels and faded Boucher.
Yeah. When I first read that a while back, I was thinking, faded butchers? What faded old butchers? Why do butchers fade more than other people?
Well, they do tend to have a more ruddy complexion, it's reckoned, but it's quite the opposite, really. Maybe they fade after. Old butchers fade away; they never die. That's got some. Quick look at it again.
Yeah, it's got some great phrases,
hasn't it? The graveyard hated by the moon. That really, what an interesting thought. I am a graveyard hated by the moon, and this we see what will become expressionism in the following generation. It begins with Gauguin and Emile Nolte. This looking in on the self, which is not necessarily healthy. Looking at that, get out a bit more, walk around the city, be a flaneur. Oh, he did. Okay, this is a very short poem, or indeed a prayer, and it's called Prayer. Glory and praise to you, Satan, in the heights of heaven, where once you reigned, and in the depths of hell, where, vanquished, you dream in silence. Grant that my soul some day may rest beside you, under the tree of knowledge, at the hour when on your brow, like a new temple, its branches will spread.
I like that. I find it really interesting. And of course, that would have alienated a lot of people, the idea of a prayer to Satan. But then basically, it seems to be sort of when he introduces the idea of the tree of knowledge. So, that's if that's the link, and that's the link that sort of quite a lot of people would say, well, actually, Satan's no more than sort of having that knowledge and the access to knowledge, the acceptance of knowledge, rather than this naive state that apparently, God wants us to remain in. Which always did seem a little odd to me.
Yeah, and it's a tree of knowledge of good and evil. So it's the knowledge of morality, of differentiating right from wrong. And by the time it's laid out in Torah, the Old Testament, it's moved significantly from its Babylonian original, where the goddess is inviting mankind into the garden to eat dates because apples hadn't arrived in that part of the world yet. And the serpent represents the Father God making the invitation. And the story changes quite completely. But it does become...
180-degree turn.
Yeah. And we have ring seals from Babylon that tell a story more than 1,000 years before it is first written down by Haberu or Hebrew scribes. But it is told to explain something about the difference between animals, the other animals, and mankind, that we put fig leaves over our genitals because we know what good and bad are. And then along came pornography, and that was the end of that. But yes, this would have been a very striking thing. It says here that it was perhaps written as early as 1846. It's one of his early poems. But the Fleur du Mal is published in 1857. So he's had time to think about it, and he, in a strenuously Catholic country where there is yet, as you say, in the 1848 rebellion, there's been a rebellion against the church, as there was during the Revolution. And so you've got factions drawn up. And he's saying, well, I'm going to say this prayer to Satan, and that would have gained him notoriety.
Yes, which he did want.
Yeah, and there's always that thing that as with Dali and Muhammad Ali, whose names rhyme, that they deliberately put forward this persona of, when Dali first arrived in America, having been tutored by Man Ray on the boat over about being contrarian, he said, there are no great American painters because they will not use shit colours. And the thing is to, deliberately poke people and get a following, which has worked so often. So to see it this far back,
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, Rambo went rather further, but we get to that. Not the Sylvester Stallone Rambo.
No, Arthur Rimbaud. Yeah, we will.
The Belgian poet.
And we may well get to him at some point.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Yes. So this next one that I'm going to read is, it's called The Spiritual Dawn. When into Rake's rooms the white and ruby dawn enters, and with it the ideal that frets the mind, some avenging mystery sets to work, and an angel wakens in the slothful beast. The unattainable azure of the spiritual heavens opens for the still dreaming, suffering, felled man, and floods down into his being as though drawn by a precipice. Thus, my beloved goddess, O translucent and pure being, above the ruins of stupefying debauch, your memory, brighter, rosier, and more enchanting, ceaselessly hovers before my dilated eyes. The sun has blackened the candle flames. Thus, O radiant soul, your ever-triumphant image is sister to the immortal sun. And that's very different from the previous poem, sort of, as we've said, sort of deliberately kind of being provocative and prayer to Satan, whereas this is something, and also very different to the music thing, that there was a real kind of downward sense in both of those, and this one is seems to be far more kind of opening up into something very positive. But also interesting, and I don't actually know about the context to this, but there's a pagan thing there. So spiritual dawn and addressing this to a goddess. And I don't know any more specifics about the context of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's always something that's interesting about artists and poets. Something that I noticed when I was at art college and studying painters, that critics and historians talked about the art and the life, but they very rarely talked about the beliefs. And so when I moved completely to reading what the artists themselves said. So I read a lot of Gauguin, Kandinsky, Franz Marc, Henry Moore, all sorts of people, Fernand Léger, Picasso, Cézanne, all sorts of people, and found that what they believed was very significant to what they made. And there was sort of this, again, in talking with historians about the Nazis and saying, well, what about the bizarre magical beliefs which they held? And we know this, there's no doubt about it. That would surely have influenced their behaviour. And it's like, well, we don't really want to talk about that because there's no such thing as magic. And you go, well, yeah, there's no such thing as magic, but there is such a thing as being inclined towards a belief. So with Gauguin, he in the last 10 years of his life, was very fascinated by Buddhism. I've never seen a critical historian refer to that. Yet when you read Noah Noah or Cahiers pour Aline, or his journals, there it is. And he keeps coming back to this idea. And so if we could understand what Baudelaire, what did he actually believe? What was, the line of his life that led him to address a prayer as a very young man to the devil? And he's then talking about a goddess. Is this metaphorical, or does he have some metaphysical belief? I would think probably not, actually, but it's only a guess, because by the next generation, when you come to W.B. Yeats, they're deeply involved in very weird magical practices, which are not necessarily very healthy. Anyway, this is the 6th of the 6th.
No, it's not. It's the 5th of the 6th.
The 5th of the 6th of the 7th of the 9th. This is the 5th of the 6th. And it's the Irremmediable one. A being, a form, an idea having fallen from out of the blue into the Stygian sloth, where no eye of the sky ever sees. An impetuous angel, allured by the love of the twisted and mean, in the depths of a nightmarish dream, like a swimmer who struggles for shore. Contending in wretched distress, with a whirlpool that swivels along, singing a madman's song, performing its dark pirouettes. A bewildered man, miserably attempting a groping escape out of a place full of snakes, lacking the lamp and the key. A damned soul, fumbling down steps of an infinite stair without rails, at the edge of a gulf with a smell, betraying the clammy depths, where monsters watch below, whose eyeballs' glowing light makes blacker still the night. Themselves are all they show. An iced-in polar ship, seized in a vice of glass, searching the fatal path of this imprisoning trip. Pure emblems, a perfect tableau of an irremediable evil, which makes us think that the devil does well what he chooses to do. 2. It's a face-to-face, sombre and clear, when a heart gives its own image back, well of verity, limpid and black, where trembles a ghastly star. An ironic beacon from hell, torch of satanical graces, and a glory in consolation. Evil, aware of itself.
Interesting.
This imprisoning trip.
The Irremediable. And the last one that we're going to read out is a prose poem called The Good Deeds of the Moon. The moon, who is whimsicality itself, gazed into the window while you were sleeping in your cradle and said to herself, "This child is my favourite." And she descended with velvet steps down her staircase of cloud, and making no sound, slipped through the window panes. Then she threw herself over your body with the downy endearments of a mother, and she pressed her colours on your face. Ever after you've had green pupils and remarkably pale cheeks. It was while brooding on your visitor that your eyes grew so astonishingly large, and she folded her arms so firmly and tenderly around your neck that you have kept ever since the desire to weep. Meanwhile, as her delight grew, the moon charged the whole room with a kind of phosphorescence or light-filled poison, and this fully alive light began to think and said, "You will be forever under the influence of my kiss. Your beauty will be my sort of beauty. You will love what I love, and love what loves me, the water and the clouds, also silence and the night, the endless and green ocean, waters chaotic and elegant, the place where you are not, the beloved whom you do not know, grotesque blossoms, perfumes that make you rave, and cats that drape themselves on pianos and who groan like a woman with the voice husky and delicious. And you will be adored by those who adore me, and flattered by those who fawn on me. You will be queen of all green-eyed men whose neck I have firmly enfolded in my nighttime attentions, of those who love the ocean, the immense green, troubled and tumbling ocean, the chaotic rivers and the elegant rivers, the place where you are not, the woman whom you have never met, the ominous flowers that resemble censers from some unknown religion, the perfumes that disturb the will, and those savage and sensuous animals that are the symbols of such madness. That is the reason, my dear spoiled and miserable boy, that I stay here, watching at your feet, trying to glimpse anywhere in your being the reflected light from that terrible goddess, from that godmother sans merci, the wet nurse who gives her poisoned breasts to the moon-maddened men.
I'd just like to point out on behalf of green-eyed men that we are not all moon-maddened. It's got a real thing about green-eyed men. The little green-eyed god, I can understand that, but we shouldn't be. I know we're in a minority, but there are less of us than there are blue-eyed people. Even violet-eyed people, I think, are the rarest. But why doesn't he pick on them?
It's an interesting response to this piece.
Yeah,
I really like that. I like the language. I love the rhythms and the momentum that it builds up, and I really enjoy it as a way of thinking about the moon. It's such an unexpected thing. So sometimes you might think, well, what am I going to write about? And if you're looking for sort of subject matter, not out of desperation, but just interest, right, something different to write about. And if you choose, you can choose any object, and exploring and kind of pushing into and feeling your way into kind of what are the possibilities in this object. And it feels like that's what he's done, is exploring what, the moonlight coming into a room, and we sort of start off with, sort of like landing on a small child, and then it just goes off into all sorts of directions. What I really like.
And it gives a magical power to the moonlight, the idea of some being, some essence within that, which of course harks back to ancient religions where things are embodied. So the moon and the sun are extraordinarily important in foundations of religion.
And again, mention of goddess.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And moon maddened men with green pupils. It does say green pupils, doesn't it? Not so that's okay. I've got black pupils like anybody else.
Yeah.
Never seen anybody with green pupils.
No.
but there we go. So that was Charles Baudelaire, and you have
hang
four more.
on, yes.
No. We have four more to recommend.
Yeah, so those are the 6 that we're reading, and we're going to recommend the following. There are many, many, many. If you've enjoyed anything of the content or the style, the language, the images, the rhythms of what you've heard, then there's a lot of his work that you can go away and enjoy. We would recommend, among many others, The Giantess, Destruction, Monologue, and Which One is Genuine? That's a quirky little number, that one. We will put a list of these things in the description. We have put a list of these things in the description. So, yes, go away and enjoy them. That was Charles Baudelaire.
Yes. And as you said before, read them and read them out loud, to get the rhythm and sense of them. I also think, although I have kind of schoolboy French and that's all I've got, and I can count in German, that whenever I'm reading poetry, if it's from another language, I like a dual language edition so that I can get some idea of it. And if you chance to come round for a cup of tea sometime, you'll find that my copies of Neruda and things like this have me scribbling out the translation and writing in my own preferred version. But I do think that I'm going to have to learn to read Cyrillic, because then I can read the Russian poets as well and see what they're actually up to. And Farsi, I'd love to be able to. One of these days. It's on my list. Been on my list for about 40 years. But
I think we both want to learn Farsi, don't we? And there's a lot of, that would open up a whole new world of poetry, wouldn't it?
It does, yes. But that's a topic for another day. We will deal with Rumi and Attar and some of the many great writers in Farsi and Arabic at some point in the future. So where are we? Thank you very much indeed.
That's where we've got to.
End of script. And I'm John Atack.
And I'm Ursula Wake. Thank you very much for your time. Bye.